A resource-based economy, or RBE, is basically based on autonomous collaboration for finding and applying the most scientifically, technically, and sociologically efficient methods for broad-scale organization, resource allocation, production, and so on, with the explicit aim of meeting human, social, and environmental well-being. This economic model already exists today on a micro scale. It simply hasn't been introduced into the broad social operating system, because people have been conditioned to feel dependent on the authoritative tradition instead of personal adaptation. A resource-based economy is simply a decision-making process, an ideology, a thought process, or cultural narrative or meme, whatever you want to call it, that can be scaled out to potentially replace monetary and market economics as the primary method for global economic organization. Personally, I think money and trade will persist on some level for a while. I simply think it should be used as a secondary form of personal, peer-to-peer barter, possibly for acquiring rare collectible items and enabling unpleasant or dangerous tasks to be achieved. In other words, where humans haven't matured enough to develop an altruistic perspective, it may be used to tip the scale, but profit or money should not be the main driver for human motivation, resource allocation, and social organization as it is today, as it exploits our primitive desires to compete, exploit, manipulate, and deceive, and restricts personal, intellectual, spiritual, social, and funnily enough, economic progress, keeping us in a constant state of fear and survival. Some videos explaining a resource-based economy and the associated behaviors with the monetary system are in the video description below. But for those of you who are familiar with the resource-based economy, I'm going to run through the common objections and questions that I've received over the last few years, while trying to explain RBE to people in general. People ranging from my peers, girlfriends, families, friends, professors, teachers, fellow students, and strangers. All very different people who have startling similar reactions to the information I present. Some of the questions or objections are valid, critical, and well-balanced, that do need addressing. Some are invalid, rooted in cultural bias, from stubborn, unbalanced thought patterns that reject information conflicting with established belief systems, resulting in emotional or psychological defense mechanisms or personal attacks that are reacting from the reptilian survival part of the brain. This is because such a topic can challenge people's very identity, and in an ego-driven culture, this is perceived as a challenge to our individual survival, and hence their fight or flight response overrides the cognitive functions and rational thinking that can only be achieved when responding from a relaxed perspective using the neocortex, the latest addition to the human brain that is used for higher order thinking, creative processes, and recognizing complex patterns. In other words, through our education and corporate systems that condition us to be passive to authority, competitive, reactionary, routine and protection mode orientated, to base our self-worth on grades, income, possessions, and image, the very idea of questioning the legitimacy of such things is taboo and met with hostility and often irrational outbursts. So when talking to people, try not to fall into those traps yourself. Try not to defend your ideology and simply react. Instead, try to think about what people are asking and understand that although some questions may seem invalid, they are often coming from a genuine perspective. And some questions may actually be valid and require some critical thought on your behalf. And some may be a bit of both. I'm not pretending to be an expert, I'm just giving you some of the answers that I've given to the following reactions that I've received. I've written them in haste so that they appear natural, so they're something that I'd probably say in a conversation. Yet at the same time, because I've written them down, they're slightly contrived and a little bit more detailed than what I'd usually say to a person. But I think that's good in order to get this information across. So these are the objections that I've heard. I like the ideas, mate, but it will never happen. I'm sure many people may have heard that before. What I usually do is acknowledge what they've said. I'll be like, maybe you're right. Maybe our tradition is so ingrained that we may not be able to break the habit. Just like a drug addict needs the correct environment for rehabilitation, or he or she will continue the same destructive patterns. Maybe the environmental requirements for a resource-based economy to manifest simply don't and will never exist, and scarcity will continue to reinforce our current destructive behaviours until eventually the economy and capitalism can no longer operate, and the possibility of a new system is out the window because all of the environmental degradation, depleted fossil fuels, with insufficient alternative infrastructure, an unintelligent and passive population, and possible war-torn landscapes will simply cause the human race to stagnate or die out almost entirely. Either way, capitalism and market economics will probably end this century as resource and energy consumption rates are simply unsustainable in comparison to the human population growth rates. So yeah, I guess basically what I'm saying there is that maths doesn't care about people's ideological values. Whether people want to admit that another system is possible or not, it doesn't matter, because either way, capitalism and the free market is unsustainable inherently. However, I also would present them with an alternative. For example, Spontaneous Evolution is a book by Bruce Lipton, which explains that evolution happens very fast. It's not gradual like we've been led to believe. He states in his book Spontaneous Evolution that new scientific insights reveal that evolution actually consists of long periods of stasis, interrupted by sudden, dramatic upheavals. So maybe it is possible for people to understand our situation and adapt accordingly. Maybe the "it's just the way it is" mentality assumes a passive human nature and a static reality, when human nature is capable of change, and in reality, the only constant is change. Either way, I'm not here to predict the future. I don't know all the variables to have a strong opinion, but I know the future I'd prefer to try and create, which is something I try to emphasize when presented with that question. Another question I hear a lot is, what will people do? Well, what I usually do when people ask me this is point out that this question shows just how indoctrinated we are. Why is this person assuming some authority will dictate all human behaviour? People can do whatever the fuck they want. They simply would be less interested in acquiring imaginary units of fiat currency and will have more autonomy over their lives because they won't be told what to do every day for every hour of the day, 5 days a week. But on the other hand, some people may actually need that, and by all means, people can still remain passive for the majority. It doesn't really matter as long as enough people start to break the cultural norms and think outside the box. I'd also ask the person, well, what would you do? They're kind of assuming that everyone would do the same thing, where there's 7 billion people on the planet, and obviously people are going to do very different things. Maybe tell them what you'd do. For example, I study architecture, but I don't like the label of an architect because it's restricting. I'd still probably do something similar. But I'd still be interested in building design, community design, and probably try and integrate that skill with other people who have similar interests as myself, to use knowledge and technology to make our lives better first and foremost, and then help others. I'd try and keep fit, sleep a lot, socialise, eat nice food, and enjoy doing activities I'm not being forced to do. I would still probably like to get drunk every now and then. I'm still a human that has been bred into this culture. I'm not sitting cross-legged on a mountain emitting, positive thoughts of unconditional love and expecting the world to change from that. Another thing is, have you ever been at home for a couple of days with no job, with nothing to do? It's very boring. I don't have a job at the moment. I find things to do, more so than if I am actually working. Because when I'm at home, I actually have the energy and incentive to be productive, as opposed to just finishing work and wanting to watch TV and be lazy. Which brings me to the next question that I hear all the time. So people often say, "Why would anyone do work? Won't people just be lazy?" Well, on that, yeah, maybe for a while, because people are so exhausted from working so much of their lives that they need a break. I'd probably like a holiday and to relax for a while. But, after a while, I'd also like to, create and do something with my life. A good book I read about this is Drive by Daniel Pink. It's a great book on human motivation. It demonstrates that intrinsic motivations are what inspires great scientific and creative minds. People will do what they like to do, which, without distorted profit incentives, often ends up being highly productive anyway. And even if most people are lazy and useless, it would still be more efficient in a resource-based economy than what we have now. Right now, most jobs could easily be replaced by automation or are completely irrelevant outside of the context of market economics. Why are there so many taxi drivers when we can automate that shit? Why would anyone want to be human A-frame for Domino's Pizza if they weren't getting paid? They probably wouldn't. But that person is being useless anyway. And you don't... It's so obvious that you shouldn't even have to point out that war, people are getting paid to go and blow shit up and kill other people. And this is supposedly efficient. I guess what most people think is that employment equals efficiency. But employment is far from efficiency. It's actually quite destructive. Another thing that I get asked is, I think it comes from the Venus Project having an oversimplified solution to crime, saying that prisons and police will be eradicated, which is a good idea to strive towards. But people often ask, what about criminals and evil people? Well, I usually say, let's stick with prisons for now, but how about instead of seeing that as a solution, that we address what is actually causing criminal behaviour as well? So we've got to address problems of social inequality, deprivation, and drug abuse, and probably many other things that we haven't discovered. So also, evil is a metaphysical term. Ask the person, what do you mean? People that kill for fun? That rape people? And if I don't feel that whole lot confident talking about this subject, because I'm not very well read on it, but I'd simply say, I don't know, it's not really my area. But if I had to guess, I'd say people that kill or rape for fun have been raised in an abusive environment. I'd also say that rape is possibly associated with the idea of monogamy, the idea of explicit sexual ownership, and female sexual repression in sexually charged ego and status-driven cultures. But like I said, I don't have all the answers. Something that people often say if you start to offend their ego identification with their capitalist values or whatever, is they'll say, this sounds like a cult. Is this a cult? What you're talking about is you just want to join a cult and fuck off and live in the forest. Or when people say things like this, I'd ask, try and rationalize it first. What do you mean a cult? I looked up a definition of the cult on the internet, and it means a system or community of religious worship and ritual. I somewhat agree with that definition, but I'd also define a cult as a subculture, which I think is partially where the word possibly stems from. And to that I'd say, well, I guess with both definitions, I guess you could call it a cult if you mean that we want to make a system or community based on an ideology using scientific thought as a kind of ritual. But, are you calling it a cult because you want to simply throw a label at me so you can dismiss everything that I have said and put it into a box to the side so that you can ignore my points? And also, if you do think that what I'm describing is a cult, then isn't capitalism and the market system also a cult? Isn't this a community of people that worship profit, fiat currency, and the invisible hand of the free market, using trade, consumption, and labour as their ritual, while working for their financial elite priests 40 hours a week, who, half their salaries go to them through taxes? I guess the point here is that everyone subscribes to ideological and cultural rituals to one degree or another, whether they choose to identify with them or not. So people also ask, why do you still live in the system if you hate it? Why don't you just go live in the bush? Had that question asked quite a few times. It's a bit silly. But, I say, well, I'm not pretending to have ascended beyond my surroundings. I'm not above the system. I use the system because I have been born into it. I currently feel as though I am dependent upon it. I I guess I could go live in the bush. I could, but if I really wanted to escape. But I'm not really basing my ideas explicitly around my own life or my own self-interest. It's not about me. How would living in a bush solve poverty? How would living in a bush solve war? And at the end of the day, a bush can still be bombed. So I don't know. I think this question, you have to really get to the point that it's an invalid question. It's simply there to distract you and to tell you that you're not part of society for thinking this way, to just go fuck off. And you just have to point out that by someone asking that question, they're completely ignoring everything you say. They're trying to make it seem as though you have some kind of personal problem and it's your responsibility to fuck off, as opposed to taking responsibility for the culture that surrounds you. Another question I get asked a lot is who will make the decisions? Which it's not. I don't think this is a bad question. I don't think it's that invalid. I think there is some confusion around this question in general, even for people like myself who's read a lot and listened to a lot of Zeitgeist lectures. But I think I think what I usually say is, who updates Wikipedia? My point is with that is decisions are based on information input into databases of some kind. And this is so that economic decisions can be arrived at as scientifically as possible in order to ensure human and environmental well-being. I don't know the names of the hypothetical organizations of people making the decisions. I don't even know if people will make the decisions in the future. Maybe artificial intelligence is actually necessary for that level of complex decision-making. I think this question also assumes a highly authoritarian and collectivist society like we have now, where in fact, in the future, individuals may be more responsible for making their own economic decisions, more so than today. And, what I think is important to point out is, who makes the decisions now? The corporations that own the puppet politicians and fund their campaigns to control and manipulate public opinion. Profit right now is the thought mechanism driving broad-scale social decision-making. Alternatively, science applied for social and environmental health could be the thought mechanism driving broad-scale social decision-making. So another question I get is, isn't this socialism, communism, Marxism? What I point out with those questions is they are ambiguous terms. So I ask them, what do you mean specifically? It probably has aspects of those ideologies. In all honesty, I'm not too familiar with those ideologies. I've never been interested in politics or history in general. A resource-based economy possibly has similarities with capitalism as well. I'm not too sure. But, take this on a a per-case basis, because everyone's definitions of these terms is highly varied. Something I get asked quite a lot, it's more of a statement, is, people say, people like to own nice things, which, yeah, they do. I'm not saying that we should all, strip down to our underpants and go live in a bush, like a lot of people just like to assume, to dismiss everything you have to say. So usually when people say people like to own nice things, I agree. I agree. I'm quite a materialistic person. I like to own things like my clothes, my phone, my own computer, my artwork. But, I don't really want to own a helicopter that I'd use a few times a year. But I would like to have access to such an item if I wanted. I wouldn't care if other people got to use it in between, or even if I couldn't use the exact same helicopter every time I wanted to go fly. I don't give a shit. All I know is that right now I can't even afford to hire a helicopter under the market system, let alone buy one, or take the training classes that would actually still be necessary with or without money. There's nothing wrong with wanting to own or wanting to have nice things. I'm quite materialistic. I love technology, clothes and that stuff. I identify with them. But materialism isn't the same as consumerism, which I think is a very important point. Materialism is not the same as consumerism. They're two different things. They're two distinguishable terms. You can have nice clothes, that last a long time if made properly with sustainable materials and sustainable automated production techniques. And you can have technology that's updatable with design properly. You could even have access to nice sports cars, limousines, and things like that if these cars had, the appropriate automated driver technology and engines. And, were probably distributed through society appropriately instead of sitting dormant in people's driveways or parks for the majority of their lives before unnecessarily consuming fossil fuels. Another example is drinks from vending machines. It's nice to have a nice cold drink when you're out in public. But, they don't have to be made from shiny plastic bottles. What about appropriately sanitized, reusable aluminium bottles or things like that? Oh, gross, yuck, that's disgusting. Yeah, but, people use other people's cutlery at fancy, expensive restaurants. How many people have put that in their mouth before you? Probably a few thousand. It's all just, cultural biases a lot of the time with these types of questions. And it's just it's important to point it out, I think. One, I think that's huge in Australia, in our culture, a question that it was more of a statement as well, is, guys like owning their own car. I got my sick car here, it's got the bloody double exhaust and shit, mate. That's fucking great. But, I agree with that statement if you put the word some in front of it. Some guys like owning their own car. I don't, hence why I don't own a car. I ride a scooter. It's cheaper and funner. I think guys also often like to own their own car because it attracts females in our current culture. They like to own cars that are loud and scary so they can prove their manliness. But some guys also may genuinely like having access to a unique vehicle on demand. Maybe they're interested in this technology. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But to say guys like owning their own car is like saying women like cleaning and cooking. It's sexist and not true. I'd much prefer to, not have to worry about repairs, insurance and all of that shit. Instead, have a car drive itself to me and let me either drive it or drink beers in the back as I travel without, worrying about getting a drink driving fine. That sounds like, a lot more freedom. Another thing, on the ownership level, is that people often say, people like owning their own house. Which is true to an extent, but I'd break it down. I'd say, people like having a roof over their head in a nice location, in a well-designed building, yes. Some people like to identify with one specific property for their whole lives, perhaps. But, others may prefer the freedom of residential mobility. If people didn't have to work at a set location to pay their mortgage for their house, people could live a lot more nomadically and travel around a lot more. I think, this kind of lifestyle would also alleviate many problems that arise from lack of cultural integration and associated territorial mentalities. And when you think about it, do people even own a house now? Many people can't even afford it and have to rent anyways. And even if you do supposedly own your own house, do you still need approval to build on that property or change the house? What if you want a different coloured roof? Do you have to ask the council? I know that some councils even require uniform colours on the facades of buildings. So ownership is an abstract notion, and it's pretty much just inhibiting our well-being and potential to live a fulfilling life. A subject often gets brought up as well is food. Right now we obviously eat a lot of unhealthy food, which, I think unhealthy food should still exist in a resource-based economy because people like to eat food not just to provide nutrients for themselves but also for pleasure and social purposes. But something I think that is hugely misconstrued with food in a resource-based economy is people associate eating out at restaurants with consumerism. So people often like to say, people like to eat out and dine at fancy restaurants. And I usually just, full on agree. Yes, I do that myself. I like to eat out at restaurants. I like to have a nice meal. I like to see what people are making that I haven't thought of yet, so I can cook some food at home for myself based on these foods. Whatever, it's good to try things that you're not capable of making yourself in your own house. So I agree, but on the other hand, many restaurants could also be entirely automated. Fast food joints could, pretty much be provided through vending machines. This could be applied for bars as well. You can have automated bars. And then, for, your upper class restaurants and your fancy cocktails, you could also have people, working there in a more traditional, labor intensive hands-on setting. Many people enjoy cooking and sharing their creation with people that they like. So I think this trend of chefs and, bartenders would continue and possibly even thrive. It's actually more efficient also if people ate publicly as the norm, because, this would require less individual domestic fridges, stoves, and all that shit. And also the relevant energy consumption from those, from those items. Food could also be mass-produced, stored, and distributed, there'd be less distribution before being prepared. If a restaurant produced too much food in a monetary system, they just throw it away. But in a resource-based economy, all food is given away in general. But maybe if you want deep-fried caviar, then you might have to pay or, do someone a favour to get it. But in general, food would be provided for free, so there'd be no problem in overproduction to a certain extent. Eating in public would also increase the social aspect of our day-to-day lives. And, it would decrease the microwave dinner and TV dinners that are all too common in our supposedly sophisticated system. People often, bring up, won't this be a threat to monogamy and marriage? And, maybe it is, but, monogamy and marriage, what are they? I think they are ideas. I think they're good ideas for some people, for certain stages of their lives. But, on the other hand, I see it why do you need a contract to feel secure if you love each other so much in that relationship? Why do you even want a monogamous relationship to begin with? Because you think it's the best way to potentially raise a child in the current environment? That's a fair point. Or maybe it's because, it's the social norm and the moral thing to do, supposedly. But yeah, maybe monogamy is just one of many ways humans interact sexually. And maybe it's somewhat rooted, pun intended, in the concept of private property and cultural lag from our, patriarchal traditions. Maybe it's also related in the concept of the nuclear family. And maybe these ideas should not be something that we feel we must strive for, rather than something that is incidental to our social and environmental circumstance. Maybe the American dream is not actually based on what actually makes people happy. A great book on this subject that I've read is called Sex at Dawn by Christopher Ryan, which I would strongly recommend. But yeah, I think it's something. I think that's a fairly valid question, and should be dealt with respectfully. Because usually, people aren't having a go at you for asking that in general. What about competition? How do we get rid of competition? There's another question I've been asked. I think in general the idea of demonizing competition in certain circles and the Zeitgeist Movement, I think it's taking a bit too far. I think competition is one of many motivators for human activity. I think there is sexual competition in monogamous societies, which is partially okay. I think there is athletic competition in sport, which is partially okay. What I don't think is okay or natural is the idea of market competition. I think it's important to differentiate competition and market competition because it's a subgroup. So this means competing for extrinsic rewards. and this competing for extrinsic rewards detracts from the initial aim of the task at hand. For example, energy companies that own fossil fuels that we are dependent upon are supposedly providing us with the service of energy. However, they also have vast incentive to stifle alternative energies that their competitors may be inventing, which would, ultimately eliminate the relevance of the existing establishment in the society. This phenomenon is called mutually exclusive goal attainment, which pretty much means success is not based on self-improvement of a task, but on the conscious effort to make others fail at the same task in order to get ahead. Competition is not a quality that people have unless they need to have it. A good book on this and YouTube video is called The Case Against Competition by Alfie Kohn, which is definitely worth the look. In this he states, "I'll tell you why you're being competitive. It's because you live in a society that demands of you every day of your lives. The term healthy competition is a contradiction in terms. Not only is competition not required for excellence, its absence is required for excellence. The more complicated the task is, the worse competition does. The more cognitive problem solving and creativity is required, the worse competition stacks up when measured against cooperative approaches. Competition causes anxiety, distracting from the task at hand." So yeah, these are all very good points on why competition is bad in certain areas. Well, it's not entirely unnatural or natural. It's just something that exists, and we should recognize it for what it is. Something I think is a good point often brought up by people that isn't sufficiently addressed by people in the movement in general is, where's the incentive for shitty jobs that have to be done? There's a lot of crap jobs out there that people genuinely would not want to do. There's dangerous jobs that people wouldn't want to do, which, I think there's two sides of the coin. There's a lot of jobs that have to be done within this system that wouldn't have to be done within a resource-based economy. But then again, there's a lot of jobs that would have to be done regardless, that people may still not want to do. An example is like surgery. Most people that are surgeons are purely motivated by money. It's an unpleasant and disgusting job, and it's not usually done out of any form of empathy. Some people may want to be a surgeon for free to help people, but this would probably not compensate for the amount of surgeons that we have today. And also some people, that would result in some people that need surgery may actually not be able to get surgery in a resource-based economy, which is definitely a flaw worth acknowledging. You have to acknowledge the flaws of our ideas, otherwise people won't listen to you. But on that point, what I think is important is how many people need surgery but can't afford it in the current system anyway. How many people's needs are not being met in this example anyway? How many accidents or illnesses that require the surgery could also be prevented if we lived in a less stressful society with abundant healthy food, clean water, clean air, free time to exercise? Transport systems that are void of human error for the most part. In a resource-based economy, we probably wouldn't have as many surgeons that we have today, but we would likely need far less surgeons than we do have today. Another example could be nursing homes. Who would want to work in a nursing home? Well, why aren't there families and communities looking after these people as part of their community today? Maybe they don't have time from all the work they have to do, all the stresses. Why are they segregated and forced to look out of a window on a cocktail of medication during their twilight years, waiting to die? If we were in a different system, maybe their families would take responsibility if given no other choice, and given the time required to actually take care of them. Of course, you do need the facilities as well, possibly. But yeah, I'm not saying everything will go fine, but And this logic may not actually be able to be applied to all areas, like sewage treatment, dangerous jobs, which is why I think some form of barter or monetary incentive could be used as a secondary motivator to gain access to items of luxury, privilege, or services that may not be available in abundance yet. Maybe someone needs to clean the toilets that aren't automated. Maybe you get that deep-fried caviar you wanted if you do that. Maybe, say, like unsustainable behaviours and habits, like eating deep-fried caviar, could be used as an extrinsic reward for doing things that otherwise may not be done until the collective values change entirely. A point people often ask about the infrastructure, the energy, and the city systems. How do we get there? Is it possible? And I think this is a very broad question. So I pretty much, like, on the basis of that infrastructure, energy, and city systems, with energy, I think many people seem to think that we are relying on fossil fuels because the alternatives are still inefficient in comparison, which may be partially true. But I think the main reason, from what I understand, is that our dependency on a depleting resource is very profitable in the supply and demand logic of market economics. And a scarce supply and a high demand is what industry profits from. So what many people don't seem to understand is that in order to actually build the required alternative infrastructure, we will need X amount of fossil fuels to not only provide the energy for such a task, but to also feed the population, because it's 10 calories of fuel in every calorie of food that you eat. We also need the fuel to manufacture tyres, plastics, roads, new transport systems and city systems, and many other things that we often, forget use fossil fuels. For that point, I would recommend Michael C. Rupert, his video Collapse, which is a great documentary. It explains peak oil very well and why it may be too late to depend on alternative energies, especially if the economic system that we have continues for much longer. The entire society that we have may actually collapse, and we may have to start from square one. But, at the end of the day, I don't pretend to know if the energy and infrastructural transition is possible or not. I think it's just, it's too broad, there's too many variables, exponential growth of human population, depletion of fossil fuels, the potential of our technology, the information boom where, people are becoming smarter and smarter from the internet. There's so many things to consider. What I think is important to point out is the relationship. There's a cyclical, codependent relationship between cultural sustainability and environmental sustainability, or socio-economic sustainability and infrastructural sustainability. So you need the cultural values to be sustainable to have the sustainable infrastructure. To break it down a bit more, you have environmental sustainability, which is, the creation of technological efficiency, the creation of abundance, which could then result in the recognition of our interdependence, resulting in more cooperation, which could transmit into cultural values, and then you have cultural sustainability, and it works backwards as well. So you may need people's values to be sustainable, so that you get the cooperation, the recognition of our interdependence, which would manifest in us wanting to create an abundance, which would then result in us wanting to create technological efficiency and hence environmental sustainability. Another point that people often bring up is what happens with manufacturing in a resource-based economy. With the ability to manufacture on demand, what if I wanted a submarine that shoots torpedoes for fun? I think people, I use that as an example, but what people seem to imply is that just because there's no monetary transactions, that there's going to be a huge lack of restriction on what people can do. This could be a problem, I guess, if people have domesticated 3D printers that can print anything. We almost have now people being able to print guns, but that exists without money. And I don't see why licensing and authority couldn't play a role in certain areas of society, even in a resource-based economy. Right? Like, it's important that we're not promoting a utopia where people can do whatever they want. People often think that, aren't we just replacing a socio-economic hierarchy with the intellectual hierarchy? I think, this question is fairly genuine. It's a fairly good question. I say the concept of a resource-based economy depends on, autonomous human action and collaboration, and without exploitation. And without that incentive, the resource-based economy simply would never exist. So hierarchical values will need to be, diminished quite substantially. But, sure, there would be smart people that have more respect than others. It'd be determined by what they offer for society and the people around them, but not what they have accumulated from the society around them. There's many more questions that I could go through, but I guess to leave you with an irrational response that you may get is people might attack you. One I've got is, shut the fuck up, you preacher. Just shut up. What I think is important to point out when people get like that is when people get angry and call you names, usually it is simply a sign that what you're saying is making sense and they don't want to admit it. They don't want to accept your information. So they're trying to dehumanize you, put your information in a box to the side, and forget about it. And there's no need to get angry at them when they behave like that, which can be very difficult. But after it happens a lot, you probably get used to it. Simply point it out to them that, are you calling me a preacher because you don't like what I'm saying? This is just information that I'm presenting you with. Are you a preacher for talking about music or sport? Are you a preacher for teaching anything that you have learned? And even by remaining apathetic and not even voicing an opinion, aren't you simply preaching for the status quo? You should also tell the person you shouldn't be mad at me. If you're mad at what I'm saying, it says more about your insecurities than it says about the information that I'm presenting you with. So there's many, things that people throw at you, and I think it's just important to keep a cool head and to think rationally. Try not to defend your ideology too much. Just try and listen to people. Accept that a resource-based economy, as it currently stands, has a lot of flaws that do need addressing. There's heaps of valid questions. Try and recognize all questions have a certain level of irrationality and a level of rationality, and just try and be calm and not have a reptilian response like our society is so used to defend the ego. If you don't know something, just say, I don't know how this would happen. I think that's important. Instead of trying to make something up, just say, I don't know, maybe go do a little bit of research on it. Or maybe you don't, maybe you just don't care. But whatever, just take things on a per case basis.